Good evening. Welcome to Evening at the Fed, a professional development series for educators put on by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. We're so pleased to be able to spend this time with you this evening to talk about some of the trends that are happening, issues that are facing educators in today's world that you can then take back and use in your classroom. Evening at the Fed is a series that we do traditionally in-house at our Federal Reserve Bank in Kansas City and the branch offices in Oklahoma City, Denver, and Omaha. But this year, given the COVID and the pandemic, we're taking advantage of this opportunity to do a full series for more people to be engaged in. Tonight is the first event of the series, and we have a number of topics lined up over a total of 5 different webinars. It's an ambitious program that looks at everything from workforce development, which you'll learn about tonight, to the impact of COVID on our economy, to a number of other issues, looking at the changing energy landscape, for example. As you'll receive new information from across the Federal Reserve System, new research, new insight, new tools that you can then take back to your classroom. All participants in these series will receive a certificate of participation from the Federal Reserve, as well as an opportunity to receive a prize that will be given out at random at each one of the webinars. So we look forward to your participation in the series as a whole. Tonight's session is focused on workforce development, looking at careers and skills for the 21st century. Even before the pandemic hit, the workforce world was changing. We're looking towards new jobs of the future, and we're now clearly in it. The impact of COVID has been dramatic on the workforce landscape, on employment opportunities. And now as we look at getting people re-employed and moving into careers and skills, this issue is even more important. We have 2 presentations tonight on this topic. The first is by Keith Wardrop. He will be talking about opportunity occupations, new research and data trends. This idea of opportunity occupations is very broad in scope, looking at what type of jobs are available that provide a good solid income, but do not require a full 4-year degree. In a sense, a middle path for individuals as they're looking into the career and their workforce. Keith Wardrop has done extensive research on this. He is a community development research manager at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. He'll then be followed by a deep dive into digital skills for the 21st century, presentation done by his colleague at the Philly Fed, Alvaro Sanchez, who's an analyst with the Economic Growth and Mobility Project. Alvaro has focused his research on a number of issues focused on low and moderate income communities, such as broadband, small business startups, affect economic mobility. We'll follow that by Q&A with the presenters. And at the end, followed by a presentation by Gigi Wolf from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City that will talk about specific resources and tools that you can take to the classroom to put these new concepts to work. So that's our agenda for the evening. As you listen to the presentations, please put forward any questions that you may have using the Q&A box on your platform. We will be taking those, responding to some as they come in, and then also responding to many of them with the speakers during the Q&A session. So with that, I would like to hand it over to our first presenter, Keith Wardrop.
Hey, thank you, Steve. I'm unmuted, I'm sharing my video, and I'm sharing my screen. I think that's all I really had to do. All right. Well, Steve, thank you for that great introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Steve said, my name is Keith Wardrop. I'm the Community Development Research Manager at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And I'm going to spend what little time I have with you this evening highlighting some recent research on occupational mobility that some co-authors and I released in June. Before I do, I need to mention that my views are not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. So my next slide, I'm going to explain why it is exactly we undertook a study of occupational mobility in the first place. In 2019, some colleagues and I conducted some research on the employment opportunities facing non-college workers across the US. We wanted to know what share of the national economy, and not just what share, but which occupations specifically paid decent wages and didn't require a four-year degree. I think most of the people on this call know that roughly 2/3 of American adults do not have a four-year degree. And I think there's this general misconception that if you have to earn a four-year degree if you don't want to make minimum wage your whole life. And this research initiative was really focused on shining a light on that middle path that Steve referenced. So we coined the term opportunity employment as employment that's accessible to workers without a bachelor's degree, and that typically pays above the national annual median wage of around $38,000 or so, adjusted for cost of living differences. And what we found is that overall, just under 22% of all employment met our definition of opportunity employment. We found that some of the largest opportunity occupations, including some in the skilled trades and in healthcare, are expected to experience above average growth in the coming years as well. Now, we were able to conduct this analysis for 121 of the largest metros in the US, and as you'd probably expect, we found quite a few differences across the regional economies. So here's what we found in the Kansas City metro area. First, we found that the opportunity employment levels were closer to 30% in Kansas City, much higher than the 22% overall. And this was good enough for 10th among the 121 metros we studied. And you can see on the fact sheet on the left, the 29.6% in opportunity employment and the ranking number 10 over there. You know, and this 10th place for Kansas City, it comes about for a number of reasons. Partly it's because of the jobs that are available in Kansas City. It's partly because employers are less likely to ask for a bachelor's degree for some of these middle wage, middle skills jobs. But it's mostly because costs in the Kansas City metro are very low relative to the nation, which means that jobs didn't have to pay as much to get over that threshold to sort of move from lower wage employment to what we consider opportunity employment. We also found that the largest opportunity occupations really cover the landscape. If you look at the fact sheet, you can see that the largest range, they include secretaries and registered nurses, from bookkeepers to construction laborers. They really run the gamut, everything in between. But it's really important to note that while these jobs don't typically require a four-year degree, they do generally require some kind of post-secondary education, on-the-job training, or experience. If you look at that list, of course, registered nurses and truck drivers have to be licensed. Construction laborers might need an apprenticeship or a vocational school. You really can't be a supervisor of retail sales workers if you've never worked in retail sales, right? So these aren't jobs that you can typically get with nothing more than a high school diploma. And once we had a better sense for the landscape, and because we all know that some workers do get stuck in lower wage jobs, we felt like the next obvious question to ask and answer was, can we create pathways into these and other higher wage jobs by leveraging workers' existing skill sets? And if we could do this, we might be able to reduce the amount of training and experience required for a new hire, which would minimize costs for workers and for employers, would maximize productivity for workers and for employers, right? So it would be a win-win. So here on my next slide is a quick overview of the research methodology we undertook to answer this question. If you've seen many research presentations, you know every researcher has to include at least one slide on methodology. I promise this is my only one. So at its core, an occupation, your occupation and mine, it's really just a collection or a bundle of tasks that a worker has to complete. And what really differentiates one occupation from another are the skills required to do those tasks, right? So the skills that I need to conduct statistical analysis using a certain software package might be different than the skills that someone might need to develop a curriculum or a lesson plan to teach students to interact with parents, right? Different jobs include different tasks, which require different skills. And so with this in mind, we analyzed millions of online job advertisements in the 33 largest metros in the US. And we focused on the 25 skills that employers listed most often in their job advertisements. And so our approach, this analysis entirely hinges on the notion that these 25 skills define an occupation in a given labor market. And what we do next is we compare these skill sets, these required skills, for all the lower wage jobs and all the opportunity occupations in these metros. But we focus on pairs of jobs, on transitions between jobs that would produce at least a 10% pay increase, but not require a bachelor's degree. And then we do a little bit of fancy math in the background. We calculate a similarity score that measures the degree to which these pairs of occupations require similar skills. And the score ranges from 0 to 1. And we consider any pair of occupations with a score over 0.75 to be a top transition. I know we're going to have some time for Q&A at the end. I know I kind of glossed over the methodology, so if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer those questions then. But let's get to the findings. So as illustrated on the next slide, one of the first things we learned was that there's a high degree of similarity between the skills required for lower wage jobs and the skills required for opportunity occupations. You know, we hear a lot about the skills gap, but I think our research suggests that skills can be viewed as a bridge. So on this slide, I'm showing a table of the 20 most in-demand skills in our study. And you can see there's a column labeled overall intensity. All that means is the percentage of job ads that requested this skill. Remember, we looked at tens of millions of job ads over these 33 metro areas. And this is the share of all those job ads that requested this skill. And these are ranked from 1 to 20 overall. But then I'm also showing the ranking for lower wage jobs and for opportunity occupations. And if the skill ranks in the top 10, I've shaded it a dark orange. And I think the first thing that's going to stick out to you is that the first 6 skills on this list rank in the top 10 for both groups of occupations. So these are soft skills, or some people call them 21st century skills, like communication, customer service, organization, teamwork, collaboration. You know, these skills, I think we would all agree, these skills can be transferred from one job to another. But this table suggests that they can be transferred from a group of lower wage jobs, from a group of better paying jobs. Now, if you look down the list, of course, you're going to see some differences. But I think overall, the story is one of transferability and of similarity. Now, no one works in the overall labor market, right? We all have very specific jobs. And if you looked at the skills required, say, for carpenters and registered nurses, they wouldn't have a lot in common. But we do find what we call top transitions in every metro. And this is an example of one. So this is pulled from our analysis in Phoenix. And it shows, again, a top transition with a very high similarity score for retail salespersons, which is a lower wage job. You can see in the call out box, retail sales workers make about $21,000 in Phoenix. And sales representatives of services, I'll just call them sales reps, they make about $48,000 in Phoenix. And if the skill is shaded blue, it means it's required for both of these jobs. And you can see there are a lot of blue shaded skills going from top to bottom. You see sales, customer service, communication, teamwork, product sales, building relationships, organization. Now, if the skill is shaded orange, what that means is that it's required to be a sales rep, but not a retail salesperson. And so you can think of these orange skills as the skills gap. There aren't many of them on here, but some of the top ones are marketing, Microsoft Excel, Microsoft Office. And maybe with a little bit of training to fill those gaps, workers could pretty easily move from a retail sales job making $21,000 to a sales rep job making $48,000. Now, this is just one example. In Phoenix, in our study, we find roughly 4,100 across the 33 metros. Now, what I think personally is even more encouraging is that we find that roughly half of lower wage jobs in this study can be paired with a top transition, can be paired with another job in the same labor market that pays at least 10% more and that requires a very similar skill set. And on this chart, you can see for lower wage occupations, sometimes these connections are between lower wage jobs and these better paying opportunity occupations. But sometimes they're just to another lower wage job that pays at least 10% more. Now, I don't think any of us would turn down a 10% raise. So I think that's still a meaningful transition that could put someone on a pathway to an opportunity occupation potentially. Now, I've mentioned a few times that in order to be considered a top transition in this study, the pay increase has to be at least 10%. We found, in fact, that the wage gains associated with these top transitions can be much more substantial. So on this slide, I'd ask you to look at the bottom row in this table. What we find is that for these 4,100 top transitions, the typical origin occupation, the starting occupation, like retail sales or like retail salesperson, the typical job paid around $30,000. But the typical destination occupation, like sales rep in the previous example, paid closer to $45,000, which is roughly $15,000 higher, or almost 50%, an almost 50% pay increase. And you can see in the second row that making a move from a lower wage job to an opportunity occupation, again on average, you could see a pay increase of 78%, or over $22,000. I'd like to make this research a little more concrete. So on this slide, I'm going to show you the top 10, the top 10 top transitions in the Kansas City metro. We found 91 in Kansas City overall, but these are the 10 with the highest similarity score. And in this table, I'm showing the origin or the starting job and its wages, the destination or the target job and its wages, and then the percent wage increase. And there are a few things that stick out to me on this slide. I know it's a lot to digest, so I'm just going to kind of highlight a few things that stick out. Again, there's a real variety of jobs represented on this slide. In the first row and then toward the bottom, you see that there are transitions between lower paying and higher paying sales positions. In rows 2, 3, and 4, you see that there are transitions between maintenance workers and either better paid maintenance workers or industrial mechanics or industrial technicians. There are also a couple of, I guess what you consider more white collar jobs. So bill and account collectors to credit counselors, business operations specialists to other managerial positions. If you look at the percent wage increase, you can see that in some cases we see increases in the teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, even 135% in one example. So on my next slide, I'm going to just go over a couple of strategies that I think could help workers make these transitions, but that would also benefit employers in the process. I know I mentioned earlier, this I feel like is a win-win proposition. And the first is skills-based hiring. So skills-based hiring could expand applicant pools to include workers who don't have a bachelor's degree, but who do have many of the skills required to do the job. Now, in order for this to work, I think workers themselves and employers have to recognize that skills are portable, not just from a short order cook to a cook in a restaurant, not just from not making an obvious move, but skills are also transferable and portable in jobs that may be more dissimilar on the surface. But I think the onus is more on the employers in this case, because the employers have to know what skills they need. They have to list those skills in their job advertisements, and then they have to commit to assessing candidates on whether or not they have those skills, rather than expecting that someone with a higher level of education does have those skills and somebody without a bachelor's degree doesn't. Now, to be clear, our research doesn't suggest that a worker could make these transitions with no training. I've talked a lot about the similarity of occupations and similarity scores, but I've never said any two jobs are identical. So targeted training could provide otherwise qualified workers with the skills they need to make a transition. And whether that training happens on site at an employer, at a community college, at a workforce development organization, I think collaboration between all of the key players, employers, education providers, workforce development organizations, can ensure that training meets local demand. So next, I would like to highlight just quickly a pilot study that we're a part of that I think perfectly illustrates that kind of collaboration. So the Philadelphia and Cleveland Feds are serving as research collaborators on an initiative run by the Education Design Lab. And this initiative is called the Community College Growth Engine Fund. There's a link in at the bottom of this slide if you're curious, or you could just Google any of those terms and I think you'd find it. But Education Design Lab is piloting a development of what they call micro pathways at 6 community colleges across the nation. And we are, as the research collaborators, we are providing information like I've done today on opportunity occupations and on the skills that employers are seeking in these labor markets. And then Education Design Lab is going to work with community colleges and employers to design and develop curricula to help students move through these pathways and developing the skills they need to fill these in-demand jobs. Now, as I mentioned, there were 6 community colleges were selected to participate, and somehow none of these community colleges are in Philadelphia or in the Cleveland district or in the Kansas City district. But we did want to make sure that we could share our research more broadly with anyone who's interested, whether they're workforce development practitioners, employers, teachers, guidance counselors, students, and workers. So we created this tool, and I'm just going to give you a really quick demonstration. So this Occupational Mobility Explorer, and I think there should be a link in the chat box or in the Q&A box, has 3 functions. The first function is and I think they're pretty intuitively named, is the Build Your Path function. And I mentioned that this study covered 33 metros. 2 of them might be more relevant to you than others, Denver and Kansas City. So let's start with Denver. Select Denver, and then I'm going to type in retail salespersons. You could use the drop-down menu, but I know where I want to go here. Retail salespersons is a very large occupation in Denver and almost everywhere. And what this tool does is allow the user to view information on their selected occupations. You can see there are 46,000 jobs for retail sales workers in Denver. It shows their wages at $22,000. And then it lists the jobs that are most similar, so that have the highest similarity score. From top to bottom, I think it only shows 10. Counter and rental clerks, another sales rep job, a couple of supervisory sales positions, another sales rep job. But let's select the first one, counter and rental clerks. So we'll add that to the path. And this is an iterative process. It's called build a path because there aren't just 2 steps. You can take multiple steps. And then when you click build a path on one card, it then shows the most similar occupations to that card. So now we're seeing the jobs that are most like counter and rental clerks. And I could add this job to that path and so on. Now we could compare the skills of these workers here, but I'm going to go to the, again, pretty intuitively named Compare Skills tab. And here, why don't we select Kansas City? So I'll pick Kansas City, and then I'm going to show you the skills for one of those top transitions on a prior slide. So it was for installation, maintenance, and repair workers. And that was industrial machinery. Oh, I knew that was going to happen. Industrial machinery mechanics. And much like on that example from Phoenix, this application shows you the most in-demand skills for these 2 jobs. And because we knew this pair had a very high similarity score, it's probably not surprising to see that there's a lot of overlap in the skills required for these 2 jobs. And as you scroll down the list, you see there's just a very high level of similarity in these skills. When you get to the bottom, you'll see the skills that aren't paired. So the skills in blue are required for maintenance workers, and the skills in orange are required for the better paying industrial machinery mechanics. And again, these might represent what you might think of as the skills gap where training efforts could focus. So skills like packaging, hydraulics, forklift operation. And then lastly, the third tab just allows you to view and download, if you want, information on all the top transitions we found in each metro. So I mentioned there were 91 in the Kansas City metro area. And much like on the prior slide showing the top 10 in the Kansas City metro, we have information on the starting or origin jobs, information on the destination jobs, you know, how much the wage increase would be, and then what the similarity score is. And as I mentioned, you could download them by clicking this button here. So that brings me to the end of my comments. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation, and I appreciate your time.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Keith. Really appreciate that. As always, come away from your presentations with a lot of information and a lot of questions as well to follow up with. We're going to hold those questions to the end of our next presentation, but I do want to encourage all the participants that are watching this webinar, please use the Q&A function on your platform to submit your questions as we move through this. And that will really tee us up well for our conversation after Alvaro Sanchez takes us to a deep dive on digital skills training and digital skills careers for the 21st century. We're going to move now from the broad picture of opportunity occupations to a more specific deep dive into this one sector that offers opportunities to so many of our students and communities. As we make that transition, we have a poll that we're going to put out. Let's see your answer. So where are you joining us from tonight? I'm going to take about 20 seconds for that. And as we're waiting on those answers, please, again, check for that Q&A chat function to be able to submit your questions. All right. Alvaro, you want to take us away?
All right. Thanks, Steve. Hi, I'm Alvaro. I'm an analyst on the Economic Growth and Mobility Project at the Philadelphia Fed. And I wrote Digital Skills for the 21st Century Workforce with Ashley a few years ago. So I'll get this started. Okay. So before I get into the material of the report that we wrote, I do want to give the same disclaimer Keith did, that these views that I'm expressing are my own, and they don't reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. And so this work sort of grows out of an initiative called the Economic Growth and Mobility Project, or EGMP, which is a newer initiative started within the past several years at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, dedicated to promoting equal access to economic opportunity through a few different buckets, three in particular, but the one that we'll be focusing on today is workforce development, and how digital skills and workforce development are quite intertwined, especially leading up to this year and moving forward into the future, and what it means for workers trying to upskill and reskill, especially given automation and the pandemic and all of the recent changes going on right now. And so this report relied on several listening sessions that we held during the summer of 2018. So notably pre-pandemic, and we hosted them at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. The participants that we recruited were both from the workforce development field, but also business leaders that represented industries within Philadelphia and the region, notably tech, healthcare, manufacturing, and the finance sectors in particular. And so what really motivated us to get started on this work was the rapid change of, in particular, middle skills jobs, and how this subset of the workforce has required workers to develop a durable, robust, and dynamic digital skill set. Burning glass technologies is just one set of research that has shown that 8 in 10 middle skills jobs require a degree of digital proficiency. And now certain jobs are digitizing quicker than others, but overall, the vast majority of middle skills jobs are changing quicker than sometimes the workforce development field and certain industries are prepared for. And so there was a need to really think proactively about how to prepare for incoming workers and incumbent workers in particular, those mid-career professionals, and having them prepared for that increasingly digitized occupational tasks, and especially those tasks given the fact that automation is replacing a lot of those repetitive tasks that are, have been traditionally performed by people. And so getting into more of the research now, a couple overarching themes sort of emerged when we were talking to these business leaders in particular about what made it so challenging to confront the inundation of digital skills necessary to perform occupations within their industry and within their companies. And so the first of those dual challenges was the fact that digital literacy and industry knowledge were needed to be a productive and successful member of a company, a productive worker. And so employers need workers to have a robust, durable skill set, but to have their sector-specific contextualized knowledge around that technology that they're using. And so really what that meant is that they understood the business or the company that they were part of. And so that helped them execute the tasks more efficiently and productively. And something else that, you know, a lot of the business leaders had mentioned was that the conceptual knowledge of a technology is only as good as the business acumen that the worker brings to that job. So it's really important to develop workers to be well-rounded as well as digitally literate. And so the second challenge was no matter the worker being incumbent or mid-career or incoming, it was hard to develop workers that were lifelong learners. How to do that in a way that's, you know, successful for each worker. And so part of that was developing learning agility on top of developing digital skills. And that was one way that a lot of workforce development leaders saw as, you know, promoting a dynamic, durable, and relevant skill set that would last through years or decades. Another topic that came up was de-emphasizing specific tools like coding in certain languages that can change quite quickly. You know, from year to year, I can attest myself in terms of the research that I do that's quantitative. You know, I might be relying on a specific coding language for a specific project one year, and I might rely on a specific package within that coding language a little bit more, and then the next year it's completely different. And that happens all the time across industries. And we found that this was particular to tech, but it could also be seen in manufacturing and healthcare and the other sectors as well. And so in addition to that, it's understanding not necessarily a specific tool, like a specific statistical software package or a coding language, but understanding how innovative technology year in, year out, quarter after quarter can be implemented within a company. That's the sort of skill set that is also needed on top of the specific tools that a worker is going to be using. And that's sort of how you'd like to consider developing that worker. So one of the participants in one of the listening sessions had actually mentioned something that was interesting, and I think it encapsulates this whole slide quite well. It's that the half-life for digital skills is much shorter than it used to be. And I think that really gets at the fact that year after year, and as time goes on, more is expected of workers in terms of their skill set. But in addition to that, it's the type of skills that are demanded by employers are going to change. And I think it's important to consider that as well. And so there are a few financial limitations that were brought up and that became quite overarching themes throughout the entire listening session experience that we had, especially as we started to talk about potential solutions. And it was twofold. One of those being the flexible funding situation that may or may not be there for specific regions and then across the board. And so there seemed to be a lack of flexible funding based on the listening sessions that we were holding. And so in particular, it seemed that non-traditional programs or newer programs that might be able to adapt to the industry demands of certain employers lacked adequate financial support. Or on the flip side, it seemed that there wasn't enough financial support for workers to actually go and participate in those programs. So one thing that a couple of the employers mentioned was that regulations may be prohibiting funding from programs that don't meet requirements. And that impacts programs like coding boot camps that may be short-term or that may not fit within certain regulations. And so one employer, or rather workforce development professional, had mentioned that, you know, certain coding boot camps weren't eligible for Pell Grant grantees because they didn't meet a 600-hour requirement, or they weren't long enough. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that funding is flexible or available to those folks, and therefore they miss out on certain coding boot camps or certain training programs that might be beneficial to them and fit their schedule better. And that's just one example. And so that lack of flexibility is quite harmful to low and moderate income job seekers. And at the time, of course, we were in a tight labor market. And so obviously now it's a bit different. But at the time, it was quite a challenge for Philadelphia regional employers, because that was a time where we were trying to really widen the net and discuss how to widen the talent pool that we were pulling from. And so the second issue that came up was innovative training and sort of, even if there was funding available for a lot of the non-traditional programs, there was sort of an issue in terms of perceived risk around alternative talent pipelines, where those pipelines were coming from and how they're being trained. And so there is a need to start thinking critically about shifting hiring practices, retention practices, and upskilling practices, and embracing those innovative training programs. And I'll get into a little bit later how employers and workforce development providers thought about ways to sort of shift hiring practices and upskilling practices. But there was a real need to start thinking about what feedback loops needed to be in place to start recognizing that alternative talent pipelines and workforce development programs were probably needed to be supported a little bit more. And so we identified about 5 opportunities to invest in digital skills based on sort of the financial and skills-based challenges we found moving into this. So those were apprenticeships and work, learn, earn programs, new credentials that have come up that need to be recognized and considered, upskilling and reskilling incumbent workers from within your own company, new funding models to pilot and scale digital skills training programs, and tech training partnerships that might be valuable for regional stakeholders, specifically employers within a region. And so the first of those 5 opportunities was the apprenticeship and work, learn, earn programs. And those are, your on-the-job learning programs without that allow a worker to really get into an industry and in an occupation, learn from an actual industry professional, and kind of set up their place within an industry while learning the job, learning the digital skills needed for that job, and sort of being able not to forego income within sort of a school or traditional training program where you would have to, forego income for, maybe 2/3 of a year or an entire year. And so that experiential learning really something that we found that employers said was that it promoted a deeper understanding of a sector while also promoting learning occupational tasks associated with certain roles, particularly in manufacturing, and on-ramping a lot of those folks that were coming into manufacturing without necessarily a whole lot of experience. And one of the overarching pluses of this sort of model was that it offset the financial barriers and time constraints that a lot of low and moderate income job seekers or workers have when they're trying to upskill or reskill themselves. The next opportunity that we began talking about quite a lot within these listening sessions were new credentials and how to identify them and look for them as a viable option for upskilling and training, particularly in the tech sector. Looking for folks that might have a CompTIA or Amazon Web Services certification, and making sure that they were being considered in the hiring process, in particular, for those roles. And something that started to come up quite a lot was that qualified workers don't necessarily have to have a bachelor's degree or a 4-year degree to be quote unquote competent, but really trying to recognize that it's important. These newer credentials are important to consider and to sort of have a better understanding from within the industry as competent workers. One of the challenges and one of the things that a lot of workforce development leaders within these sessions discussed was that there needed to be better feedback loops from employers to training providers to make sure that these programs were efficient and actually efficient in delivering workers with skills into the labor market so that employers were able to hire them. So in this next slide, we talked a little bit more about upskilling and reskilling incumbent workers, but having it be an employer-led solution to develop workers that are actually already within a company and to support them in particularly financially to go back to school while working, or to promote opportunities to actually learn while on the job. And this was something that became a little bit contentious within the listening sessions, because there was a sort of moment where we said to ourselves that the labor market has changed quite a bit, where in one instance, a workforce development leader had mentioned that, workers were sort of partnering with employers in the past to develop themselves, but that was not necessarily the case anymore. And there's a whole apparatus of training programs that exist outside of the workplace, but really trying to consider how employers can lead with supporting workers through either their own funding or through their own internal trainings to promote, allow workers to get the necessary skills they need to remain competitive in the labor market, but to also make sure that they're contributing and productive within the current jobs that they have, and as those jobs are changing. And so the last thing that was brought up with upskilling and reskilling incumbent workers was developing career pathways that were specific to each worker, and their particular jobs and their goals and what was needed of them within their roles. And so we started talking just a little bit more about how funding models might need to change to be more flexible. And one model that came up was a collaborative funding model that pulls capital from national and local philanthropy for like-minded firms that were looking for maybe, within the same industry, looking for similar skill sets. And so sort of pulling together that capital from philanthropy to promote certain training programs that met the needs of a group of companies. And then what happens is those programs become intentional. It's an intentional push to get workers to upskill within a region that meet the needs of regional businesses. And so in addition to those new funding models, a common theme from a lot of the business leaders in the room was that tech training partnerships and breaking down silos was going to be important leading into the future of their particular industries. So those partnerships within industries would be intentional about developing talent pipelines and expanding the pool of workers that they would take from to make sure that their companies were thriving. And so that collaboration within between regions could take on a few forms. And one of them was leadership councils that were maybe led by chambers of commerce or other local business leaders, or streamlining information between firms to understand what was needed within an industry and sort of what certain businesses were looking for and what others were looking for as well, to really inform new funding models leading into sort of a more developed workforce. And so really, a lot of this work, like I had said, was written, or rather, it was written 2 years ago, but a lot of the listening sessions they happened 3 years ago. So what can we do now? And so first, it's really important to continue identifying workforce development models to invest in digital skills, especially now and through this economic crisis. And a lot of that might mean that we have to consider not just like making sure people have access to workforce development training that emphasizes digital skills, but that also might mean the fact that we have to consider a lot of folks may not have broadband at home, and we might start needing to think about broadband access and certain things about just like having access to computers while we're not actually able to go out to specific training program centers and things like that. Additionally, now more than ever, we've got to strengthen feedback loops between training providers and employers to really understand where certain industries are going and to have a better understanding of what sort of skills employers need. And that does put the onus a little bit on employers, but it's important to make sure that those feedback loops are efficient in between regional workforce development, training providers, and those employers. And so in addition to that, it's important to continue the conversation about shifting organizational focus towards advancing innovative workforce development solutions. And that includes those new credentials that I had mentioned earlier, identifying them and acknowledging that those are viable options, and the best workers aren't necessarily those that have a 4-year degree, but those that have been in these programs and that have those credentials. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was uh, developing workforce development models that account for digital disruption. And that kind of gets to the thing I was saying at the first point, but who doesn't have access to broadband? Who doesn't necessarily, and what that means for their attachment to the labor market, and what that means for them moving forward in terms of getting them actually in programs that teach them digital skills and digital literacy. And then also understanding that digital disruption means certain groups are at a disadvantage when it comes to digital literacy and digital skills development. So that should be the last slide. Yep.
Well, thanks so much, Alvaro. That was great presentation. Looking at one set of workforce development issues in a new way. And as I was listening to that, I was trying to think about it from the position of our participants tonight, educators. And a couple of things kind of struck me as I tried to put myself in their place. One is, would I consider myself being part of workforce development if I was an educator in a classroom, working with 11-year-old kids? Is that my goal? Is that workforce development? And I would say that yes, workforce development is a broad enough topic to be able to say educators in classrooms are a part of it. But it's not workforce development just moving people into a job, but really moving people into mobility and careers, stability as they move forward. Many of the things that Keith talked about in his presentation, when we look at this idea of opportunity occupations, how do we help individuals see a broader vision of the world? How do we help them see where they fit within it? And then how can we help people to set goals and aspirations that they can attain? And I think both Keith and Alvaro talked about that in some different ways. And so, yes, educators are part of workforce development in a way, but they're not reduced just to that only. And Alvaro, I'll start off with a question from you. And as I ask this, I'd encourage all the participants, please use the Q&A function and send us in your questions as they pop to mind. And we're watching those and we're bringing those into the conversation. But there's a bit of a tension, again, as I said, as a teacher. At one point, you mentioned, Alvaro, that we need to move away, de-emphasize the idea of specific skills like coding and move to more focus on critical thinking, it seemed like, and by extension, possibly teamwork and innovation. And I was thinking, wow, that's great. That is what I do as a teacher. And then the next piece, though, there was another piece, but we also have to have skills and show them through certifications. And when we talk about certifications, those are usually much more specific and skill-based. So how does that tension play out in kind of these workforce strategies?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so there is sort of a natural tension where we're saying we want workers that are, have specific skill sets and that are going to come onto the job and be able to perform specific tasks. But then all of a sudden you're, a lot of, and then by extension, the workforce development community saying, okay, let's make sure we have classes and curriculum set up so that these specific skill sets are made available to these workers. But then a lot of employers are saying, well, then that's not all that's the problem at this point. It's really the business acumen, or it's really making sure that these folks are lifelong learners. And I mean, you kind of said it a little bit earlier in your remarks, but it's about not just the workforce development training providers, but also the fact that it begins earlier, critical thinking, than we would think. And it begins, in before the post-secondary, or before, or rather before, folks get out into the real world as adults. It's really a lot of the K through 12 infrastructure that teaches a lot of critical thinking skills. That's not where it stops, but it's really important to consider the fact that that's a big foundation of it as well. And I think that was brought up within the listening sessions. How do we start talking to not just colleges and universities, but how do we start connecting with folks in the K through 12 system to make sure that students are coming out with the critical thinking skills that are needed to begin to adapt and to begin to be lifelong learners throughout their careers. But I do think that there is a natural tension that is there, and that could probably be resolved by just more efficient feedback loops as well between employers and those training providers. So I think, you know, that those are kind of the things that we've got to start considering when we talk about, you know, we don't want just like whiz coders, but we need lifelong learners. It's complicated, but I think it takes that sort of approach.
Yeah, and those feedback loops are so important. And that, you know, and a big question is, how do you get into that loop? How do you get into that feedback loop as an educator, as a training provider, as a business owner seeking appropriate workers for their jobs? And part of that kind of goes to a question I had for Keith about this idea of more emphasis on skills, you know, being able to show your skills, being able to be hired based on your skills. How would you suggest a job seeker, you know, going into an opportunity occupation that doesn't require a certification, for example, how do they show their skills? How is a way that a teacher in high school could counsel one of their students on putting their best skills forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think before you get to the point of needing to know how you show your skills, I think you have to have someone on the other side of the table who's receptive to the demonstration, right? I think that employers need to be receptive to that message, because it honestly doesn't matter how the worker can show or demonstrate their skills if there's not someone listening or someone paying attention. If the requirement for a 4-year degree is so hard and fast that it truly doesn't matter the specific skills that someone brings to the job. I do think that there are a number of opportunities to do some online learning. I mean, we hear about these MOOCs, these massive online courses. I almost feel like there's probably a training available for most anything that you would want to learn and then want to demonstrate sort of completion. So whether there's a certificate of completion that comes at the end. And I get the sense that employers who are opening themselves up to skills-based hiring are also becoming more open to the content behind those certificates. I do think, though, that there's a little more that has to be done. I saw a study not too long ago that said that there are, I don't know what it was, 400,000 credentials and badges and certificates and certifications. And I think there's just so much out there that it's difficult for an employer to make real sense of it, right? So what exactly does this certificate demonstrate? So I think the field has a way to go in order to provide some clarity around that. And you hear a lot about sort of industry recognized credentials, right? I think that for a worker interested in a particular field, learning which of these credentials and certificates are salient to the employers that hire for these positions and pursuing those, whether it's online learning, community college, I think that they're going to get a lot more traction that way than if they just randomly maybe take a course through Coursera or something to that effect. That's a really good question. I do think that employers are increasingly moving towards skills-based hiring. I'll be honest, I'm a little concerned. Alvaro talked about the depth of the labor pool and how his research was done and our research was begun when unemployment was at 3.5%, and by the time we released our report, it was in double digits. We know that in past recessions, employers have sort of ratcheted up their requirements because they could be a little choosier with job applicants, right? The labor market wasn't as tight. There were more applicants for every job and they could be a little choosier. So I'm going to be interested to see if the same thing is going to happen during this recession. If some of these middle skills jobs that don't always or often require a 4-year degree, if employers do sort of raise the bar just a little bit.
Right. Yeah, and on that idea about the thousands of different certifications that are out there, it is really difficult to be able to evaluate, their worth, both as a person seeking a job and seeking new skills. Is it worth my time and money? Or on the flip side, as an employer saying, does this certification really certify what it says it does? And there is a kind of a national program going on that's evaluating those, making a database of all the certifications, and basically putting a kind of a good housekeeping seal of approval on a subset of them. And so I believe that's out of the George Washington University, just off the top of my head. If folks do have interest in learning more about that, feel free to put a note in the question box, and we can get more info for you.
Steve, one thing I should have said, we were talking about certificates and certifications, but employers can also layer on assessments onto their job application process. And these can be, for coding aptitude, or they can be for assessments for certain soft skills. And so, it's one thing to sort of list a credential on a resume, but it's another for an employer to truly test an applicant for the skills that they have and be blind to the credentials that are on the resume.
Great. And as a student is working through their kind of career plans, one of the questions is, well, how do I adjust my focus? Where do I know to go? And Keith, you showed us the Occupational Mobility Explorer. Is that a tool that could be used in a high school classroom as part of career exploration? Have you seen that being used in that way?
We haven't seen it used that way yet, but we just released it maybe 4 weeks ago, and we've had the holidays in between. So I think it could be. I think it truly could be used for career exploration. There are some other tools that, and I can, if Alvaro gets the next question, I can post the links in the Q&A box or in the chat box, or we can share that afterwards for everyone. But there are some other more maybe consumer focused online applications. So you can identify, which jobs you've had in the past, and it sort of pre-populates which skills you probably learned on those jobs. And you can select additional skills or deselect others. And it will actually identify, much like our research did, similar jobs in the same market, and then actually connect you to some training courses that might be of interest. So I can, maybe Steve, what I can do is send you links to those if there's a follow-up email to attendees, because I think in addition to our tool, which is focused on economic mobility, making sure there's at least a 10% pay increase, not requiring a 4-year degree, I think there's definitely a place for that in career exploration. But these other tools might be a little broader and might be also of interest to students or workers looking to make a change.
Right. So I would encourage whoever submitted that question, reach out to Keith. It looks like you could do a pilot of it, and I'm sure he'd publish a paper with you. So jump on that. I'd like to turn back to Alvaro. You brought up this idea of the feedback loop between educators, trainers, and employers. How have you seen that feedback loop working in a new way, a positive way, between, say, high school teachers and local industries, local employer groups? Have you seen any way? And I guess the question is, again, if I was sitting here as a teacher, a question I would have is, how do I make a meaningful engagement with the local industries?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've seen it happen in a few instances, but not nearly enough. And I want to say that first of all, because I think that that's something that a lot of employers should be pursuing. And I think that it's something that we hopefully will see begin to occur a lot more. And so, I've seen it in that, one example is that the local Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce has been intentional about connecting industry leaders with local Philadelphia County high schools to actually, hire like high school interns to come in and do certain tasks that might be asked of, undergraduate students. It's not necessarily limited to those post-secondary students, but, really bringing in those high school students to do tasks that are, essentially internships, and getting that early industry knowledge at a younger age. And that's just one feedback loop that happens. But in addition to that, it might be, getting in touch with counselors, or getting in touch with a lot of the, I was about to say industry leaders, but administration from certain school districts, and meeting on a regular basis or on a quarterly basis to sort of share the needs that they've found in particular industries. And that could look like, focusing on STEM careers and what sort of skills are going to be needed in those sort of careers. Because I'm sure lots of schools are trying to beef up their STEM programs, and it really helps to understand what kind of skills will be needed, entering into not just a post-secondary educational, environment, but actually like going into, careers right out of high school, and understanding what skills will be needed so that they can be put either into training programs or apprenticeships, or one of those sort of opportunities that I mentioned earlier. So the feedback loops, in our region, I haven't seen them all that much, and I hope to see more of them. But those are just two examples that I've personally seen and written about in other case studies with the Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce. Hopefully we'll see more.
Yeah, that's great. I think that idea of apprenticeship programs are really interesting, because it brings together the employer, industry perspective, the training provider, educator, and really pays money to a person to start learning their skills. And we've seen a great growth in apprenticeship programs in high school settings and across our district here. Oklahoma, Colorado, Missouri, have some great examples of strong apprenticeship programs embedded within high schools. I think that's exciting. Another piece, kind of a feedback loop that we have seen a bit is school districts that will support a teacher to do an internship or a placement with a local industry. So spend a week in the summer working on the shop floor. We talked with an employer at a battery manufacturing company in Missouri, and he said his hardest problem in hiring people was getting people to have a different perception. He wasn't hiring a janitor. He was literally seriously hiring a technician, that the janitor job of today uses computers. It's completely different. So that idea, that perception. And so there have been some great examples of teachers having the opportunity to work in those situations, in those settings, to say, hey, this really isn't, my grandfather's shop floor. The world has changed. So we would love to, in addition to the Q&A, we'd love to hear examples of participants. If you had a program like that, if you've been able to participate, or if you know of some good examples, I know our team would love to learn more about that, so we could highlight that work. Good. And so, one of the things that, and I think a bit of a motivator for some of this work, particularly around the opportunity occupations, is that we're in a bit of a world where it's, you go to a 4-year degree when you get out of college. Get out of high school, you go to college, 4-year degree, or maybe you go to the military route, or you just try to figure it out yourself. But what's that other option in there? And as Keith found, nearly 22% of open jobs provide a solid option. But Keith, how do we get that word out? What barriers do you see in making that known, changing that perception, and what can teachers do to address it?
That's a great question. I almost feel like, the aspiration for a college degree is sort of the new American dream in some cases, right? And I think that, honestly, I think that the attention that people are paying to student loan debt is one lever. I personally think that student loan debt can be a really good investment for someone. So I'm not at all suggesting that students should not take on student loan debt to go to college. But I think the attention that issue is getting is helping some students, some parents, maybe be more thoughtful about whether or not, or precisely what their career aspirations are, and whether or not a 4-year degree is required. I think through getting the information to K through 12 educators, guidance counselors, I think is another step. Talking with community colleges, but it is a tough nut to crack. Highlighting the research is the best answer I can give at this point, and I appreciate the opportunity to do that today, and I'll take any opportunity you can find for me in the future. But I think as I said, the issue of the trade-offs that students take when they go to college, and the rising profile that student loan debt has gotten has made some folks at least sort of take a step back and reconsider whether or not it is a good investment for a particular student. Right.
Yeah, and I think sometimes just by naming an issue or naming an object, we're more likely to see it. And that's one of the things I've appreciated from this research around opportunity occupations. It's by putting a focus on it, putting a name on it, putting some boundaries around it, we're more easily able to see it as an option and as a real positive option for ourselves and people that we work with. We have about 2-3 minutes before we hand it over to Gigi to talk about some specific tools and resources we have for teachers. But as we move into that, Keith and Alvaro, any last words of wisdom or a charge you put before us? Alvaro?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I want to leave folks with, especially with my research since it was done a few years ago, is that we are really working through a time where, and we were at that point, but we're still working through a time where communication is key between the employers and the workforce development for training community. Now more than ever, it was important back then, but now more than ever, it's important to consider, employers communicating their demands and what they perceive to be their demands into the future, so that workforce development leaders can actually, shift their programs and their curriculums to meet those demands. And like I was saying, there's an issue with flexible funding and certain programs that are innovative and non-traditional, able to meet the demands of employers quicker than maybe those traditional programs. But we're still relying a lot on those traditional workforce development providers to train the bulk of our workforce, and to do that in an efficient manner, we need those feedback loops, and we need to make sure that we're emphasizing communication between those sectors. So that's really what I want to leave everyone with, especially given the fact that the research was done a few years ago. That stays the same in particular, from those listening sessions to now.
Great, thank you. Keith?
I'll just say that just reflecting on our research, I think when you distill an occupation down to the task level and to the skill level, I think it opens up a world of opportunities. I think it really does create and demonstrate and illustrate connections between jobs that might appear dissimilar on the surface. And I think that can be informative and liberating, I think, for some workers who realize that, hey, I've done this thing for 5 years and not made a lot of money, but along the way, I've developed skills that would allow me to do that thing and make 20% more, right? And maybe not tomorrow, but maybe with a little bit of extra training. And I think that could be liberating for students and for workers. And I know Alvaro and I have both said puts the onus on employers, but I'll say it again, it's not enough that workers understand it or that students understand it. There has to be reciprocity, and there has to be an understanding and a willingness to recognize and let workers deploy those skills in a way that lets them be economically mobile. So that's what I'd like to end with.
Great. Well, Keith and Alvaro, thanks so much for being with us here, coming all the way from Philadelphia, and appreciate your work and information you brought. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gigi Wolf from Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and she is going to provide some information about tools and resources that we can use to translate this into the classroom. Gigi?
Thanks so much, Steve. Good evening, everyone. As Steve mentioned, I'm Gigi Wolf. I'm with the Kansas City Fed and help to coordinate our economic education outreach and engagement throughout the 10th District. And along with my colleagues here in Kansas City, as well as in Denver, Omaha, and Oklahoma City, we provide professional development and programming for educators. And we also develop content to support instruction in economics, personal finance, and career development. So I'm pleased to have this time with you this evening to share some of our newest career development resources. And several of them actually tie into the data and the research that you've heard about earlier this evening. So I'll be providing an overview of a new lesson plan that we've developed, along with an interactive virtual resource, some new infographics that tie into workforce development, as well as a series of videos that are now available. The first resource that I'd like to share with you is a lesson plan called Skilled Trade Pays. It's focusing on the driving question of how opportunity employment factors into the US labor market overall. So it really takes that research, the data that you heard about earlier from Keith and his team, as well as from Alvaro, and allow students to really apply it in a classroom setting. They get to dive deeper into that research and analyze it, interpret it in order to not only learn more about specific opportunity occupations, but also about those skills that will help build their human capital. So the lesson takes place over 3 days, and some of the key objectives include looking at being able to reason, analyze information about that research, and also being able to compare and contrast between the various opportunity occupations, and then also evaluating their own human capital. On day one of the lesson, that's when they're really digging into that research. So looking at an executive summary, reading that, as well as looking at the graphs, the charts, the data about opportunity employment across those 121 metropolitan areas that were a part of Keith's team's research. And then on day two, students they begin to work as a group collaboratively to look at specific opportunity occupations. And part of that is looking at some of those that are key to the industries, or include key industries within cities within the 10th District. On day three, students are collaboratively sharing what they've learned, delivering their research through a presentation and also a visual that they've created that can be shared either in the classroom or in the school building for other students to learn more about career pathways. So you could see here in this slide, these are the specific opportunity occupations that are included in the deeper dive part of the lesson. And it also includes opportunities for students not only to dig into that research, but there are several inquiry-based opportunities for students to really think through kind of how all of this ties into the labor market overall, but also their role within it. There is a ready-made evaluation that is provided for the teacher, and it includes an opportunity for you to score both individually and as a group. And students then also complete a couple writing assignments to close out the lesson. There's also several extension activities that go along with that. And the lesson overall ties into both economics, personal finance, and English language arts Common Core standards. The next resource that I'll share with you is an interactive, interdisciplinary resource. It's the second level of our Teaching Tips series. For those who aren't familiar with Teaching Tips, it is a way to take the research that's been conducted by senior or Fed economists and making it more palatable, easier to understand in a classroom setting, and really involves inquiry-based activities for the students to look at that data so that they can better understand it and apply their reasoning to how it factors into the economy as a whole. So this particular Teaching Tips ties into opportunity occupations. And there are several standalone activities that you can allow the students to complete. And it includes multimedia, reading, vocabulary, even a section focused on mathematical equations and calculations that they're applying to that data. And so what you see here is the teacher landing page. And then you can refer students directly here to the website to complete any of the activities that you'd like them to do. And just to talk through really briefly about a little bit more about the activities, there is a vocabulary section looking at those key terms tied to opportunity, employment, and they're both research-based questions and Socratic questions for the students to respond to. And then there's a reading section that is based on about a 2,000-word article about opportunity employment. And there are questions, core level questions and advanced level questions for students to answer. There are a couple of videos that they both run under 10 minutes each. One is from an employee perspective where students get a firsthand testimonial about opportunity employment and the impact that has on this individual's personal financial situation as well as that of her family. And then the other video ties into the employer or community perspective, looking at how those how employers and community-based organizations can work together to help prepare students, prepare future workers to take on those middle skill level jobs that they offer. There are, in the facts and figures section, again, that's applying some mathematical skills and calculations. And then there are several extension exercises that also tie back into that data. So again, each of those is standalone, and students can view the videos, read the article, view those questions, and respond to them right online through our website. Next, we have a few more infographics that are all tied to workforce development. So we have one that looks at employability or 21st century skills, as we heard about earlier, and looks at kind of those core skills that go across several career pathways that are important for students to develop and can help them to be successful regardless of the career path that they may choose. We also have one that focuses on the key or top opportunity occupations within the metropolitan areas that are in the 10th district. So looking at the wages for those jobs and those skills that are needed for them, and what that, and then being able to compare between those that we see across all of the metropolitan areas and those that are unique to certain regions of our district. Then the third one compares opportunity occupations that require a certain level or certain skills, and it compares them to occupations that are similar, that have a similar skill set, but require a 4-year degree. And students are able to kind of compare here how opportunity employment can be as viable a way to earn a living as taking the other path. And so, and in a couple of instances within this infographic, students can see that going the path or going the direction of not having the 4-year degree, but yet still building those same skills can yield even a higher opportunity for salary growth. We have a series of videos that tie into opportunity occupations that happen to be within the Federal Reserve Bank. They touch on the careers that you see here. And even though they're within the Federal Reserve, they correlate to jobs that are available in the labor market as a whole. So in watching these videos that are conducted between one of our interns and a recruiter from our HR area, students can learn about each of these jobs, the responsibilities involved, the skills that students need for those positions, and also what a typical work day is like, the opportunity for growth in salary, as well as a building of skills. And each of them is under 5 minutes, so about 5 minutes. So very short opportunities for students to get a closer look at some of these jobs that are available in the marketplace. And some that they may not have even known about or thought about previously, all ways to earn a livable earning wage. And lastly, we have another series of videos, recordings of webinars that we conducted for students to learn about skills in leadership. So we brought in several speakers, leaders within their fields, and they shared their tips, tools for ways that students can work to be or prepare themselves so that they can so that they're more likely to have success in their careers. And so we had a variety of career paths represented, including executive of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, Esther George. We also had a representative from a nonprofit, government, for-profit, even entrepreneurial. So all of those career pathways are addressed through this webinar series. And each of them runs about an hour in length, but it's not standard presentations. It's really just Q&A with these leaders, learning about how they achieved the success that they have, but also how students can get there as well. And so I'll leave you with this information about how to access all of the resources that I've shared with you this evening, as well as the others that we develop. Here's a way to connect with us via Pinterest, Twitter, LinkedIn, and our videos are all on our YouTube channel. You can get to the resources specifically at kansascityfed.org/education. And then to access the research, the data that you heard about earlier, you can go to kansascityfed.org/community/workforce to get information about what Keith and his team and Alvaro and his colleagues have developed and will be developing in the future. We also wanted you to know about our upcoming events where we'll be addressing some hot topics within our economy, and these will all be our executive level economists sharing their expertise in each of these areas. So I'd like to close by thanking Keith and Alvaro and Steve for their roles this evening, and also to thank you, educators, for joining us. We really appreciate your participation, especially after a full workday and as part of your personal time. So we hope that these resources, the information that we shared, will be useful to you and to your students. We'll continue to develop more career development resources and make them available on the education part of our website. You'll receive a short online evaluation after the session. Please do let us know your feedback. We'd love to hear how we can better support you in our upcoming programs throughout the rest of the semester, as well as through the other work that we do in outreach and engagement. So, and I have to mention again your opportunity to win or to receive prizes. We will randomly draw names of those who attended, and we will be awarding 12 prizes randomly, and we'll share those winners in a follow-up email. And with that, I'll go ahead and close us out for this evening. Again, thank you for your participation, and we hope to see you at our next event. Good evening.
Gigi, are you there?
Yes, I am, Steve. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. We're done.